In the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal history echo through grand hallways, a father watches his son with eyes that sparkle with both pride and careful restraint. Prince William, the future King of England, has learned to master the art of controlled emotion in public spaces, but, behind closed doors, his joy radiates like sunlight breaking through morning clouds. The sight of 10-year-old Prince George confidently shaking hands with world leaders, asking thoughtful questions about environmental conservation, and, naturally commanding respect from seasoned diplomats fills William with an indescribable warmth. This is not just any father watching his child grow, this is a future monarch witnessing the careful cultivation of his heir's natural leadership abilities. What the cameras don't capture are the private moments, William's gentle nod of approval when George remembers to ask about a visiting ambassador's family, the barely visible smile when his eldest son instinctively knows when to speak and when to listen during formal occasions, and the quiet pride that swells in his chest when George demonstrates the perfect balance of royal dignity and genuine human compassion. The royal household staff have begun to notice something remarkable happening within the Wales family. Prince George is not being pushed into royal duties, he is gravitating toward them with an eagerness that surprises even his parents. There's something almost magnetic about the way the young prince approaches his responsibilities, as if the weight of future kingship feels more like wings than chains. This is the story of a father who must balance his natural parental pride with the careful grooming of Britain's future king, and a young boy who seems destined to wear the crown not as a burden, but as a natural extension of who he is meant to become. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Prince William sat in his private study, reviewing the day's schedule. At 39, he had grown into his role as the Prince of Wales with the same careful precision his father had demonstrated, but there was something different about his approach to preparing his own children for royal life. Unlike the more formal training he had received, William believed in allowing his children to discover their royal calling naturally. Prince George, now 10 years old, had been showing signs of this natural gravitation toward royal responsibilities for several months. It had started subtly during a family visit to a local charity event. While his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, had been content to observe from the sidelines, George had stepped forward when an elderly veteran had trouble standing. Without any prompting from his parents, the young prince had offered his arm for support and engaged the man in conversation about his military service. William had watched this interaction with careful attention, noting how George seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of when to speak, when to listen, and how to make people feel valued in his presence. These were not learned behaviors, they appeared to be emerging from some deep well of natural empathy and leadership that reminded William of his own mother, Princess Diana. The palace staff had begun to take notice as well. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, often commented to her colleagues about how different Prince George was from other royal children she had observed. There was a thoughtfulness in his demeanor that went beyond mere politeness. When visiting dignitaries came to the palace, George would remember details about their previous conversations and ask follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in their work and their countries. During a recent state dinner preparation, the young prince had surprised everyone by asking if he could help with the seating arrangements. When William questioned his interest, George had explained that he wanted to understand how to make sure everyone at the table would have interesting conversations with the people seated near them. This level of consideration for others' comfort and enjoyment was remarkable for a child his age. The transformation was becoming more apparent during public engagements as well. At a recent environmental summit that William was attending, George had asked to accompany his father. Instead of remaining quietly in the background as expected, the young prince had listened intently to presentations about climate change and renewable energy. During a break, he had approached one of the speakers, a renowned marine biologist, and asked thoughtful questions about ocean conservation that impressed the scientist enough that she spent an additional 20 minutes explaining her research to him. William had observed this exchange from across the room, feeling a complex mixture of pride and concern. Pride because his son was demonstrating the kind of genuine curiosity and engagement that would serve him well as a future king. Concern because he wanted to ensure that George's childhood wasn't being overshadowed by premature exposure to the weightier aspects of royal duty. That evening, William had sat down with his son for one of their regular father-son conversations. These talks had become increasingly important as George showed more interest in understanding his future role. William had learned from his own experience that open communication was essential in helping a young royal navigate the complex emotions that came with knowing you were destined for the throne. "George," William had said, settling into the comfortable chair beside his son's bed, "I noticed you were very engaged with Dr. Martinez today at the conference. What did you think about what she was telling us?" George had looked up with bright, earnest eyes. "She said that the oceans are getting warmer because of pollution, and that's making it hard for the fish and coral reefs to survive. I was thinking that when I'm older, maybe I could help create programs to clean up the oceans, like what you do with Earthshot Prize." The sophistication of George's thinking had struck William immediately. The boy wasn't just absorbing information, he was already thinking about how he could use his future position to make a positive impact. This was exactly the kind of long-term thinking that effective monarchs needed to develop, but it was unusual to see it emerging so naturally in someone so young. William had chosen his next words carefully. "That's a wonderful idea, George. But, remember, you have plenty of time to be a child too. You don't have to worry about solving all the world's problems right now." George had nodded seriously. "I know, Papa. But I like learning about these things. It makes me feel like I'm preparing for something important." This conversation had crystallized something that William had been sensing for weeks. His eldest son wasn't being burdened by the knowledge of his future responsibilities, he was being energized by them. The boy seemed to understand instinctively that his privileged position came with opportunities to serve others, and, rather than feeling overwhelmed by this prospect, he appeared to be embracing it with enthusiasm. The following week brought another example of George's developing sense of duty. The family had attended a memorial service for veterans of the Falklands War, and George had asked if he could lay a wreath alongside his father. During the ceremony, William had watched as his son approached the memorial with perfect deportment, his small hands steady as he placed the flowers with appropriate solemnity. What had impressed William most was not just George's behavior during the ceremony, but his questions afterward. The young prince had wanted to know about the men and women being honored, what their sacrifice had meant for the country, and how the royal family's presence at such events helped families feel that their loved ones were remembered and valued. These weren't the idle curiosities of a child, they were the thoughtful inquiries of someone trying to understand the deeper meaning behind royal protocols and traditions. William realized that his son was naturally developing the kind of historical perspective and sense of continuity that were essential for a constitutional monarch. At home, Catherine had been observing similar patterns in George's behavior. The Duchess of Wales had always been particularly attuned to her children's emotional and psychological development, and she had noticed that George seemed to be finding genuine fulfillment in his increasing exposure to royal duties. "He's not performing for us," Catherine had observed to William during one of their evening discussions. "He's not trying to impress anyone or seeking approval. This seems to be coming from something authentic within him." William had agreed with his wife's assessment. There was something organic about the way George was growing into his future role. Unlike the more regimented approach that had characterized royal education in previous generations, their son seemed to be discovering his calling through natural curiosity and genuine engagement with the world around him. The Palace Protocol Office had also begun to take notice of the young prince's developing capabilities. Sir Edward Fitzwilliam, the deputy private secretary who helped coordinate royal engagements, had mentioned to William that several organizations were specifically requesting George's presence at their events. Word was beginning to spread through diplomatic and charitable circles that the young prince brought a unique energy and genuine interest to his interactions. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Edward had said during a recent briefing, "I've had inquiries from 3 different environmental organizations asking if Prince George might be interested in visiting their research facilities. They were quite impressed with his questions at the Marine Conservation Summit." William had been pleased but cautious about these requests. While he wanted to nurture George's interests, he was also determined to ensure that his son's education and normal childhood development remained the top priorities. The balance between preparation for future duties and maintaining a healthy childhood was delicate and required constant attention. During a family dinner later that week, William had broached the subject with George directly. "There are some people who would like you to visit their research centers and learn more about environmental work. How would you feel about that?" George had considered the question seriously before responding.
I would like that very much, Papa. But, could Charlotte and Louis come too? I think they would find it interesting as well.
This response had revealed another aspect of George's developing character that particularly pleased William. The young prince wasn't seeking spotlight or special attention, he was thinking about how to include his siblings and share experiences with them.
This consideration for family unity would be crucial in his future role as head of the royal family.
The evening concluded with William feeling a deep sense of satisfaction about his son's development. George was showing all the signs of someone who would grow into his royal responsibilities with wisdom, compassion, and genuine dedication to service. The subtle joy that William felt watching these qualities emerge in his eldest son was becoming one of his greatest sources of personal happiness. As he tucked George into bed that night, William reflected on how different his son's path seemed compared to his own childhood preparation for royal life. Where William had often felt the weight of expectation and duty as something external being imposed upon him, George appeared to be discovering these responsibilities as natural extensions of his own character and interests. The foundation was being laid not through formal instruction or rigid protocol training, but through careful exposure to meaningful work, thoughtful conversation, and the gradual development of the young prince's natural empathy and leadership abilities. William knew that this organic approach to royal education was setting the stage for George to become the kind of king that the 21st century would need, someone who could connect with people authentically while maintaining the dignity and continuity that the monarchy represented. Looking ahead, William felt optimistic about both his son's future and the future of the institution they would both serve. The subtle transformation he was witnessing in George suggested that the next generation of the royal family would be well equipped to meet the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead, carrying forward the best traditions of the monarchy while adapting to the needs of a rapidly changing world. The autumn morning brought an unexpected test of young Prince George's developing diplomatic instincts when the Spanish ambassador and his family arrived at Windsor Castle for a private audience with Prince William. The visit had been scheduled as a routine diplomatic courtesy, but the presence of the ambassador's 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, had transformed the occasion into something more complex and revealing. William had initially planned for George to make a brief appearance during the formal introductions before returning to his studies. However, when Sophia had appeared visibly nervous and overwhelmed by the grandeur of the castle and the formality of the occasion, George had instinctively recognized an opportunity to help someone feel more comfortable. Without any prompting from his father or the palace staff, George had approached the young girl and began speaking to her in the Spanish he had been learning at school. His pronunciation was far from perfect, but his effort to communicate in her native language had an immediate effect. Sophia's tense posture relaxed, and she smiled for the first time since arriving at the castle. "Te gusta el castillo?" George had asked, inquiring whether she liked the castle. When Sophia nodded enthusiastically, he had continued, "Quieres ver los jardines," suggesting they look at the gardens together. William had watched this exchange with fascination. His son was demonstrating exactly the kind of cultural sensitivity and diplomatic intuition that took many adults years to develop. The decision to speak Spanish hadn't been calculated or rehearsed, it had emerged from George's natural desire to make their guest feel welcome and included. The ambassador, Don Carlos Martinez Hernandez, had been visibly moved by the gesture. Later, during his private meeting with William, he had specifically mentioned how impressed he was with George's thoughtfulness. "Your Royal Highness," he had said, "your son has a remarkable gift for making others feel valued." That small gesture of speaking Spanish to Sophia meant more to our family than any formal protocol could have achieved. This incident had marked a turning point in William's understanding of his son's capabilities. George wasn't simply following instructions or mimicking behaviors he had observed, he was developing his own authentic approach to royal engagement based on empathy and genuine human connection. The following month brought another opportunity for George to demonstrate these emerging diplomatic skills during a Commonwealth reception at Buckingham Palace. Representatives from 12 different nations were attending, and William had agreed to allow George to circulate briefly among the guests before the formal proceedings began. What happened next had surprised even the experienced diplomatic staff who had witnessed decades of royal interactions. George had noticed that the delegate from Bangladesh, Mrs. Rashida Ahmed, was standing somewhat apart from the other guests. Instead of moving past her toward more prominent figures in the room, the young prince had approached her directly. Mrs. Ahmed, George had said, having clearly studied the guest list beforehand, "My father told me that Bangladesh is working on important projects to help people affected by flooding.
Could you tell me more about that?" Mrs.
Ahmed had been startled by the young prince's knowledge of her country's current challenges, but she had quickly warmed to his genuine interest. She had spent several minutes explaining the innovative flood management systems being developed in her homeland, and George had listened with the kind of focused attention that made speakers feel their words were genuinely valued. William had observed this conversation from across the room, noting how George's questions had grown more sophisticated as the discussion progressed. The boy had asked about the engineering challenges involved, the communities being helped, and whether similar systems might work in other countries facing comparable problems. When Mrs. Ahmed had mentioned that many of the flood management innovations were being developed by young engineers not much older than George himself, the prince had responded with enthusiasm.
"That's amazing.
It shows that young people can really make a difference in solving big problems." This comment had resonated deeply with Mrs. Ahmed, who had later told William that his son's perspective had given her a fresh appreciation for the importance of engaging young people in addressing climate challenges. The conversation had evolved from a polite diplomatic exchange into a meaningful dialogue about innovation and youth empowerment. The impact of George's natural diplomatic approach was beginning to be noticed beyond individual interactions. Sir James Morrison, the Foreign Office liaison who coordinated many of the palace's international engagements, had started keeping informal notes about the young prince's developing skills. "The boy has an unusual ability to identify what matters most to the people he meets," Sir James had observed to William.
"He's not asking generic questions or following a script.
He's finding the human element in every interaction and connecting with people around shared values and concerns." This assessment had been reinforced during a visit from the Canadian High Commissioner's family.
The High Commissioner's teenage son, Michael, had been reluctant to attend the reception, viewing it as a boring adult obligation.
George had sensed this reluctance and had approached the situation with characteristic thoughtfulness. Instead of trying to engage Michael in conversation about official matters, George had asked about his interests. When he learned that Michael was passionate about ice hockey and played for his school team, George had steered the conversation toward sports and competition. The two boys had ended up having an animated discussion about the differences between British and Canadian athletic programs. By the end of their conversation, Michael had been asking George about British schools and expressing interest in potentially studying in England for a semester. What had started as a reluctant attendance at a diplomatic function had transformed into genuine cross-cultural exchange and the beginning of a friendship. William had been particularly struck by how George had managed this interaction. Rather than trying to impress Michael with royal protocols or palace grandeur, his son had found common ground through shared interests and genuine curiosity about other people's experiences. The pattern was becoming clear in all of George's diplomatic encounters. Whether he was speaking with world leaders, ambassadors, or their family members, the young prince had developed an instinct for finding the personal connection that made formal interactions feel genuine and meaningful. This approach had been especially evident during a recent visit from the Prime Minister of New Zealand and her family. The Prime Minister's daughter, Emma, was roughly George's age and had been nervous about meeting royalty for the first time. George had immediately put her at ease by asking about her pet rabbit, which he had somehow learned about through his preparation for the meeting. Their conversation had evolved into a detailed discussion about animal care, which had led to George showing Emma the palace's stables and introducing her to some of the horses. By the time the formal proceedings began, Emma was completely comfortable and engaged, and her mother had commented to William about how thoughtful and welcoming his son had been.
These successful interactions were not happening by accident.
William had begun to understand that George was developing a systematic approach to diplomatic engagement that was both intuitive and surprisingly sophisticated. The boy seemed to understand instinctively that successful diplomacy was built on personal connection and mutual respect rather than formal ceremony and protocol. Catherine had been observing similar patterns in George's interactions with people outside the diplomatic sphere. During charity visits and community engagements, their son consistently demonstrated the same ability to connect with people across age groups, cultural backgrounds, and social circumstances. "He listens differently than most children his age," Catherine had noted to William.
He's not waiting for his turn to speak or trying to direct conversations toward his own interests. He genuinely wants to understand other people's perspectives and experiences. This quality had been particularly evident during a visit to a youth center in London where George had met children from various cultural and economic backgrounds. Instead of maintaining the polite distance that might have been expected, George had engaged fully with the activities and conversations, asking questions about the other children's schools, families, and aspirations. One particular interaction had stayed with William long after the visit ended. George had been speaking with a 10-year-old boy named Hassan, whose family had recently immigrated from Syria. Hassan had been initially intimidated by meeting a prince, but George had quickly put him at ease by asking about Syrian food and expressing interest in learning some Arabic words. By the end of their conversation, Hassan had been teaching George how to say basic phrases in Arabic, and George had been sharing stories about his own travels and experiences. The two boys had discovered a mutual interest in football and had made tentative plans to attend a match together with their families. This interaction had demonstrated several important aspects of George's developing diplomatic abilities. He had shown cultural sensitivity by expressing genuine interest in Hassan's heritage rather than avoiding or minimizing their differences. He had also demonstrated the capacity to find common ground while respecting and celebrating diversity. The diplomatic community was beginning to take notice of these qualities in the young prince. Several ambassadors had specifically mentioned George in their reports back to their home countries, describing him as remarkably mature for his age and naturally gifted in cross-cultural communication. The French ambassador had been particularly complimentary following a reception where George had conversed with her in French about environmental conservation projects in both countries. His Royal Highness the young prince has a sophisticated understanding of how environmental challenges require international cooperation, she had written in her diplomatic cable. His engagement with these issues suggests a future leader who will approach global challenges with both intellectual depth and personal commitment. Such feedback was reaching William through various channels, and he found himself feeling increasingly confident about George's natural preparation for future leadership roles. The boy wasn't being coached into diplomatic success, he was discovering and developing these abilities through genuine engagement with the world around him. The most remarkable aspect of George's diplomatic development was how naturally it seemed to be occurring. Unlike the formal training programs that had characterized royal education in previous generations, George's skills were emerging through real-world experience and authentic interaction with diverse people and perspectives. William realized that his son was learning diplomacy not as a set of rules or behaviors to be memorized, but as a natural expression of curiosity, empathy, and respect for others. This organic approach was creating a foundation that would serve George well throughout his life, whether in formal diplomatic contexts or in the broader range of leadership challenges he would eventually face. As the autumn progressed, William found himself looking forward to these diplomatic encounters not just as necessary royal duties, but as opportunities to witness his son's continued growth and development. Each interaction seemed to reveal new dimensions of George's capabilities and potential, filling William with the quiet pride of a father watching his child discover and develop his unique gifts. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. George was growing into someone who could represent not just the monarchy, but the best aspirations of modern leadership, someone who combined traditional dignity with contemporary sensitivity, formal responsibility with genuine human connection, and institutional continuity with innovative approaches to age-old challenges. The evening rain drummed against the windows of Adelaide Cottage as Prince William sat in his study, reviewing the day's events with a mixture of pride and contemplation. Earlier that afternoon, Prince George had participated in his first formal constitutional briefing, a milestone that marked a significant step in his preparation for future kingship. The session had been designed as an introduction to the basic principles of constitutional monarchy, but it had evolved into something far more profound. Constitutional expert Professor Margaret Thornton from Oxford University had been invited to conduct the briefing in what was intended as an informal, age-appropriate discussion about how government and monarchy worked together in modern Britain. William had expected his 10-year-old son to listen politely and, perhaps ask a few basic questions. Instead, George had engaged with the material at a level that had surprised everyone present. The discussion had begun simply enough, with Professor Thornton explaining how the monarch's role had evolved from absolute rule to constitutional partnership with elected government. George had listened attentively, occasionally nodding to show his understanding. But, when the professor had mentioned the concept of constitutional duty versus personal preference, George had raised his hand with a question that had stopped the conversation in its tracks. "Professor Thornton," George had said, his voice carrying the careful thoughtfulness that had become his characteristic tone, "if the Prime Minister and Parliament make decisions that the monarch personally disagrees with, but which are constitutional and democratic, does that mean being king sometimes requires you to support things you don't believe in?" The question had revealed a level of philosophical understanding that went well beyond what anyone had expected from someone so young. Professor Thornton had paused, clearly recognizing that this was not the kind of superficial inquiry typically posed by children learning about government. "That's a very sophisticated question, Your Royal Highness," she had replied. "You've identified one of the central tensions of constitutional monarchy. The monarch must serve the Constitution and the people's democratically expressed will, even when personal feelings might suggest a different course." George had considered this answer seriously before responding. "So being king means sometimes the job is more important than your personal opinion?" William had felt a complex mixture of emotions watching this exchange unfold. Pride at his son's intellectual engagement was tempered by a growing awareness that George was beginning to grasp the profound sacrifices that kingship would require of him. The boy was starting to understand that royal duty wasn't simply about ceremony and privilege, it involved a fundamental subordination of personal will to constitutional responsibility. The briefing had continued with George asking increasingly nuanced questions about the practical implications of constitutional monarchy. He had wanted to understand how the monarch's weekly audiences with the Prime Minister functioned, what happened when the government changed hands after an election, and how royal neutrality was maintained during times of political controversy. Professor Thornton had been visibly impressed with the depth of George's curiosity. During a brief break, she had whispered to William, "Your son has an unusual grasp of the philosophical complexities involved in constitutional monarchy. These are concepts that many university students struggle to understand." When the session had resumed, George had posed perhaps his most penetrating question of the afternoon. "If the monarch has to remain neutral about political issues, how does a king or queen decide what causes to support through their charitable work and public speeches?" This question had prompted a detailed discussion about how royal influence could be exercised within constitutional constraints. Professor Thornton had explained how monarchs had to navigate carefully between using their platform to promote beneficial causes while avoiding anything that could be seen as political partisanship. George had absorbed this information thoughtfully before making an observation that had struck William as remarkably mature. "It sounds like being king requires very careful thinking about every public action, because people will look for meaning in everything you do or say." The truth of this statement had resonated deeply with William, who lived with this reality every day. Watching his son articulate this understanding had been both gratifying and sobering. George was beginning to comprehend the weight of scrutiny and responsibility that would define his adult life. Following the briefing, William had asked George to join him for a private walk through the grounds of Adelaide Cottage. These father-son conversations had become increasingly important as George's understanding of his future role deepened, and William felt it was crucial to process the day's learning together. That was quite a session with Professor Thornton, William had begun as they walked along the familiar paths. "What did you think about what she was telling us?" George had been quiet for several moments before responding. "It made me realize that being king is more complicated than I thought. It's not just about doing good things or helping people. You have to think about how everything you do affects the way people trust the government and democracy." The sophistication of this response had impressed William, but it had also triggered a protective instinct. He wanted to ensure that his son's growing awareness of royal responsibilities didn't overwhelm the natural curiosity and enthusiasm that had been driving his development. "Those are important things to understand," William had replied carefully, "but remember that you have many years to develop these skills and understanding. You don't need to carry all of this weight right now." George had looked up at his father with the serious expression that had become more frequent in recent months. "But, Papa, if I'm going to be good at this job someday, don't I need to start understanding it now? I want to be ready." This response had crystallized something that William had been sensing for weeks. His son wasn't being burdened by the knowledge of his future responsibilities,
he was being energized by the challenge of preparing for them. George seemed to view his royal destiny not as a limitation on his freedom, but as a meaningful purpose that gave direction to his education and development. That evening, William had discussed the day's events with Catherine, sharing both his admiration for George's intellectual engagement and his concerns about the psychological implications of such early awareness of royal duty. "He's processing all of this remarkably well," Catherine had observed. "But I think we need to make sure he understands that intellectual understanding is just one part of preparation. The emotional and personal dimensions are equally important." This conversation had led to a family discussion the following weekend about how constitutional knowledge related to practical leadership skills. William and Catherine had decided to arrange for George to observe some of their day-to-day royal work, not as formal training, but as a way to see how constitutional principles played out in real situations. The first of these observation opportunities had come during William's weekly audience with the Governor of the Bank of England. The meeting was routine business, involving briefings on economic conditions and monetary policy, but it provided an ideal example of how the monarch received information without making political decisions. George had sat quietly during the meeting, listening as the governor explained current economic indicators and policy challenges. The boy had been particularly attentive when the discussion had turned to how economic conditions affected ordinary families and communities. After the governor had left, George had asked his father about the purpose of such meetings. "Why does the monarch need to know about the economy if you can't make decisions about economic policy?" William had used this question as an opportunity to explore the concept of informed neutrality. Understanding these issues helps the monarch be a better advisor and sounding board for elected officials, he had explained. Sometimes just having someone listen carefully and ask thoughtful questions can help leaders think through complex problems. George had considered this explanation seriously. "So it's like being a wise friend who people can talk to about important decisions?" The simplicity and accuracy of this analogy had pleased William. His son was developing the ability to distill complex constitutional concepts into practical, human terms. This skill would serve him well in future leadership roles, where the ability to communicate clearly about difficult issues would be essential. A few days later, George had observed William during a meeting with representatives from several environmental charities. The discussion had focused on coordinating conservation efforts across different organizations, and George had watched as his father facilitated conversations between groups that had different approaches to similar problems. During this meeting, George had witnessed firsthand how royal influence could be used to bring people together around shared goals while respecting the independence and autonomy of charitable organizations. He had seen how careful questioning and active listening could help groups find common ground and develop more effective collaborative strategies. After the charity representatives had departed, George had reflected on what he had observed. "You didn't tell them what to do, but you helped them figure out how to work better together." This insight had demonstrated that George was beginning to understand one of the most important aspects of modern constitutional monarchy, the ability to facilitate and inspire rather than direct and control. The boy was grasping that effective royal leadership in the 21st century required subtlety, patience, and skill in bringing out the best in others. The cumulative effect of these experiences was beginning to shape George's understanding of kingship in ways that differed significantly from historical models of royal authority. He was developing a conception of monarchy that emphasized service, facilitation, and moral leadership rather than power, privilege, and command. This evolution in George's thinking had been particularly evident during a family discussion about historical monarchs. When William had mentioned Queen Victoria's strong personal influence on government policy, George had asked whether that approach would still be appropriate today. "I think people today want their elected leaders to make political decisions," George had observed. "Maybe the monarch's job is more about helping everyone remember what's important and encouraging them to work together." Such insights suggested that George was naturally developing the kind of constitutional understanding that would serve him well as a future king. Rather than viewing monarchy as an institution diminished by democratic constraints, he was seeing it as an evolved form of leadership adapted to contemporary needs and values. The transformation in George's understanding was accompanied by changes in his behavior during public appearances.
He had become more observant of how his actions and words were received by different audiences, and he had started asking thoughtful questions about the impact of royal presence at various events. During a recent visit to a hospital, George had noticed how patients and staff had responded differently to various interactions. Some had seemed energized by formal royal protocol, while others had appeared more comfortable with casual conversation. He had begun experimenting with adapting his approach based on reading the mood and preferences of the people he met. This sensitivity to audience and context was another sign that George was developing the emotional intelligence necessary for effective royal leadership. He was learning that successful monarchy required not just constitutional knowledge and good intentions, but also the ability to connect with people across different circumstances and backgrounds. As autumn deepened into winter, William found himself increasingly impressed with the maturity and thoughtfulness of his son's developing perspective on royal duty. George was growing into someone who understood both the privileges and responsibilities of his position, who could balance tradition with innovation, and who approached his future role with both seriousness and genuine enthusiasm. The subtle joy that William felt watching these developments was tempered by awareness of the challenges that lay ahead. George was developing an excellent foundation for future kingship, but the real tests would come as he navigated the complexities of adolescence and young adulthood while maintaining his sense of purpose and connection to others. For now, though, William felt confident that his son was on the right path. The boy's natural empathy, intellectual curiosity, and emerging understanding of constitutional principles were combining to create exactly the kind of preparation that modern monarchy required. George was becoming someone who could carry forward the best traditions of the institution while adapting to the needs and expectations of future generations. The crisp December morning brought unexpected news that would test Prince George's developing maturity in ways that no formal training could have prepared him for. A devastating earthquake had struck a Commonwealth nation overnight, and the royal family's response would need to be swift, sensitive, and carefully coordinated. For the first time, George would witness how personal tragedy and royal duty intersected in the most challenging of circumstances. William had been awakened at dawn by a call from his private secretary informing him of the disaster in the Caribbean nation of St. Lucia. Early reports indicated significant casualties and widespread destruction, with several British nationals among those affected. The palace would need to coordinate with the government's emergency response while providing appropriate royal support to both the affected nation and the families of British victims. As William prepared for an emergency briefing, he had made the decision to include George in the initial discussions. The boy had been asking to understand how the monarchy responded to crises, and this situation would provide a real-world example of how constitutional duty and human compassion worked together during times of tragedy. The briefing room at Kensington Palace had been somber that morning as officials from the Foreign Office, the Cabinet Office, and the palace's own staff gathered to coordinate the response. George had sat quietly beside his father, listening as the details of the disaster unfolded through official reports and media coverage. The human cost had been staggering. Initial reports suggested that hundreds of people had been killed, with thousands more injured or left homeless. Critical infrastructure including hospitals, schools, and communication networks had been severely damaged. The local government was struggling to coordinate rescue efforts while dealing with their own institutional disruptions. As the briefing had progressed, George had observed how different officials had approached the crisis from their various perspectives. The Foreign Office had been focused on coordinating with international aid efforts and ensuring the safety of British nationals. The Cabinet Office had been concerned with parliamentary protocols and government communications. The palace staff had been considering how royal involvement could be most helpful without interfering with official relief efforts. What had struck George most profoundly was witnessing his father's response to the human dimension of the crisis. William had asked detailed questions about casualty figures, rescue operations, and the specific needs of affected communities. But he had also inquired about the families of victims, the psychological impact on survivors, and how royal presence might provide comfort during such a devastating time. During a brief pause in the briefing, George had whispered a question to his father that had revealed both his growing understanding and his emotional response to the situation. "Papa, what can we actually do to help these people? It seems like the disaster is too big for anything we might do to make a real difference." William had recognized this as a crucial moment in his son's education about royal responsibility. The question touched on one of the fundamental challenges of constitutional monarchy: how to provide meaningful leadership and support when your role was largely symbolic rather than executive. "You're right that we can't solve this crisis by ourselves," William had replied quietly. "But sometimes the most important thing we can do is show people that they're not forgotten, that the world cares about what happens to them, and that their suffering matters to people they'll never meet." This explanation had seemed to resonate with George, who had continued to listen intently as plans were developed for the royal response. The discussion had covered everything from immediate charitable donations through royal foundations to longer-term commitments for reconstruction support. There had also been careful consideration of whether a royal visit to the affected area would be helpful or would divert resources needed for rescue operations. Later that afternoon, George had observed as his father had recorded a statement offering condolences and support to the people of St. Lucia. The young prince had watched with fascination as William had carefully chosen words that expressed genuine emotion while maintaining the dignity and restraint appropriate to his constitutional position. "Our hearts go out to the people of St. Lucia during this incredibly difficult time," William had said into the camera. "The courage and resilience we are seeing in response to this tragedy remind us of the strength that defines the human spirit. The Commonwealth family stands with you, and we are committed to supporting your recovery in whatever ways we can." After the recording had been completed, George had asked his father about the process of crafting such statements. "How do you find the right words when something so terrible has happened?" William had used this question as an opportunity to discuss the balance between authentic emotion and institutional responsibility. "The most important thing is to speak truthfully about what you're feeling while remembering that your words represent not just yourself, but the institution and the nation. People need to know that their pain is recognized and that they're not alone." The following day had brought a more challenging test of George's developing emotional resilience. Video footage from the disaster zone had begun circulating in news reports, showing the devastating impact on communities and families. George had watched some of this coverage with his parents, and the images of destroyed homes and grieving families had clearly affected him deeply. That evening, George had approached his father with questions that revealed how seriously he was processing the human cost of the disaster. "Papa, I keep thinking about the children who lost their families or their homes. What happens to them now? How do they rebuild their lives when everything is gone?" These questions had demonstrated that George was developing the kind of empathetic engagement with suffering that would be essential in his future role. Rather than viewing the disaster as an abstract political challenge, he was connecting with it on a deeply human level. William had recognized this as an opportunity to discuss how royal involvement in charitable work could translate concern into concrete action. Over the following days, George had observed as his father had worked with palace officials and charity partners to coordinate meaningful support for the disaster response. The boy had been particularly interested in learning about the Royal Commonwealth Society's Emergency Relief Fund and how donations collected through royal patronage could be directed toward specific needs in affected communities. He had asked thoughtful questions about how aid organizations determined priorities and how international support could be coordinated to avoid duplication of efforts. A week after the initial disaster, George had participated in his first significant charitable engagement related to the crisis. The family had attended a fundraising event organized by Caribbean Communities in London, where they had met with families who had relatives affected by the earthquake. This event had provided George with his first direct exposure to the personal dimensions of international tragedy. He had met children whose grandparents had been injured in the disaster, families who were desperately trying to communicate with relatives in affected areas, and community leaders who were organizing support efforts from thousands of miles away. One conversation had particularly stayed with George throughout the evening. He had spoken with Maria Santos, a 12-year-old girl whose grandmother lived in one of the worst affected areas. Maria had been trying to raise money for relief efforts by organizing bake sales at her school, and she had been eager to tell the royal family about her grandmother's resilience and strength. "My grandmother says that hurricanes and earthquakes can knock down buildings, but they can't knock down the love that holds communities together," Maria had told George. "She's helping to take care of other people who lost their homes, even though her own house was damaged." This perspective had clearly moved George,
who had listened intently as Maria had described her grandmother's efforts to support her neighbors despite facing her own challenges. The conversation had continued with George asking about Maria's fundraising efforts and expressing genuine admiration for her commitment to helping others. After the event, George had reflected on the evening with his parents, sharing his thoughts about what he had learned from the community members they had met. "I realized that people don't just wait for help to come from somewhere else," he had observed. "Even when they're going through terrible things themselves, they find ways to help other people." This insight had demonstrated that George was developing a sophisticated understanding of how resilience and community support function during times of crisis. He was learning that effective leadership often involved recognizing and amplifying the strength that already existed within affected communities rather than simply providing assistance from outside. The following month had brought an opportunity for George to witness the long-term dimensions of royal crisis response when a delegation from St. Lucia had visited the United Kingdom for reconstruction planning meetings. The boy had attended a reception where he had met with government officials, aid workers, and community leaders who were working on recovery efforts. During this reception, George had demonstrated the diplomatic skills he had been developing by engaging thoughtfully with representatives from the affected nation. He had asked informed questions about reconstruction priorities, listened carefully to descriptions of community needs, and expressed genuine interest in learning about St. Lucian culture and traditions. One particularly meaningful exchange had occurred when George had spoken with Dr. Patricia Williams, a St. Lucian educator who was working to rebuild damaged schools. Dr. Williams had been impressed with the young prince's questions about how disasters affected children's education and his interest in learning about educational innovations being developed during the reconstruction process. "Your Royal Highness, Dr. Williams had said to George, "Your questions show that you understand how disasters affect not just buildings and infrastructure, but the hopes and dreams that communities hold for their children's futures." This comment had resonated with George, who had continued the conversation by asking about how young people in St. Lucia were contributing to their community's recovery efforts. The discussion had evolved into an exchange about the role of youth leadership in addressing global challenges, and George had expressed interest in possibly corresponding with some of the student leaders Dr. Williams had mentioned. By the end of the evening, George had established several connections with the visiting delegation that would continue through ongoing correspondence and future meetings. These relationships represented exactly the kind of personal diplomacy that could enhance formal governmental and institutional connections between nations. The experience of engaging with the earthquake response had marked a significant milestone in George's preparation for royal leadership. He had witnessed firsthand how personal tragedy and institutional responsibility intersected, how royal influence could be channeled into meaningful action, and how individual relationships could strengthen broader diplomatic ties. More importantly, the crisis had tested and confirmed George's emotional maturity and his ability to engage with difficult situations while maintaining both empathy and effectiveness. William had observed throughout the process how his son had balanced appropriate emotional response with practical action, never becoming overwhelmed by the scale of the tragedy but never becoming detached from its human impact. As winter deepened, William found himself reflecting on how the earthquake response had accelerated George's development in unexpected ways. The boy had demonstrated that he could handle exposure to genuine tragedy and crisis while maintaining his natural optimism and commitment to positive action. The experience had also revealed how George's diplomatic skills could be applied in crisis situations, where the ability to provide comfort and build relationships became particularly valuable. His interactions with affected community members and international representatives had shown that he could represent the monarchy effectively while connecting with people authentically during their most difficult moments. Perhaps most significantly, the crisis had demonstrated George's capacity to transform observation into understanding and understanding into action. He had not been content to simply witness his father's response to the disaster, he had actively engaged with the situation and begun developing his own approaches to using royal influence for positive impact. These qualities suggested that George was developing exactly the kind of leadership capabilities that modern monarchy would require. He was learning to balance institutional responsibility with personal authenticity, to channel privilege into service, and to find meaningful ways to contribute to addressing the challenges facing both the Commonwealth and the broader international community. The spring morning sun filtered through the ancient stained glass windows of Westminster Abbey as Prince William stood beside his son, Prince George, during a private tour of the coronation venue. The visit had been planned as an educational opportunity for George to understand the historical and ceremonial dimensions of monarchy, but it had evolved into something far more profound and emotionally significant. As they walked through the nave where countless monarchs had been crowned over nearly 1,000 years, George had asked questions that revealed how deeply he was processing the weight and meaning of his future destiny. Unlike his earlier inquiries about constitutional duty or diplomatic protocol, these questions touched on the most fundamental aspects of what it meant to inherit such an ancient and significant role. "Papa," George had said, his voice echoing softly in the vast space, "when you were crowned here, what did it feel like to know that you were becoming part of something that started so long ago?" William had paused at this question, recognizing its depth and the opportunity it presented for one of their most important father-son conversations. Standing in the same location where he had taken his coronation oath, surrounded by centuries of history, he had felt the full weight of what he was preparing to pass on to his eldest son. "It felt like joining a conversation that began long before I was born and will continue long after I'm gone," William had replied thoughtfully. "But also like accepting a responsibility to make sure that conversation remains relevant and meaningful for the people of our time." George had absorbed this response quietly, walking slowly toward the coronation chair where his father had been crowned and where he himself would one day take the same oath. The boy had reached out tentatively to touch the ancient wood, and William had seen in his son's expression a mixture of awe, responsibility, and growing understanding. The months leading up to this moment had marked a significant acceleration in George's preparation for his future role. His tutors had begun introducing him to more complex aspects of British and Commonwealth history, his language studies had expanded to include several languages spoken across the Commonwealth realms, and his exposure to royal duties had increased in both frequency and significance. But, perhaps more importantly, George had begun to demonstrate a natural evolution in how he approached these responsibilities. Where his earlier engagement had been characterized by curiosity and enthusiasm, his recent interactions had shown a deeper understanding of the broader implications and long-term significance of royal leadership. This maturation had been particularly evident during a recent Commonwealth Day celebration where George had delivered his first formal speech to an international audience. The address had been carefully prepared with his tutors and parents, but George's delivery had been entirely his own, characterized by genuine conviction and natural authority. "The Commonwealth represents something unique in our world," George had said to the assembled diplomatic community and youth leaders. "It's not held together by force or law, but by shared values, mutual respect, and a commitment to helping each other become better than we could be alone." The response to this speech had been overwhelmingly positive, with several Commonwealth High Commissioners commenting privately to William about George's natural ability to articulate complex ideas in accessible terms. The Canadian High Commissioner had noted that George seemed to understand intuitively how the Commonwealth functioned as a voluntary association based on shared principles rather than historical obligation. More significantly, George's speech had generated positive response from young people across Commonwealth nations who had watched the proceedings online. Several youth organizations had reached out to the palace expressing interest in establishing correspondence or exchange programs with the young prince, seeing him as a contemporary voice for Commonwealth values. This kind of positive engagement with his peer group internationally had become increasingly important as George's public profile had grown. William and Catherine had been careful to ensure that their son's royal duties didn't isolate him from normal childhood experiences, but they had also recognized that George's unique position required thoughtful navigation of relationships with other young people. The balance had been particularly challenging during George's participation in a recent International Youth Climate Summit. As one of the youngest participants, George had needed to demonstrate serious engagement with environmental issues while maintaining the approachable demeanor that made him effective in connecting with other young delegates. George's contribution to the summit discussions had impressed both the adult organizers and his young fellow participants. Rather than simply repeating talking points about environmental conservation, he had shared specific examples of sustainability projects he had observed during royal engagements and had asked thoughtful questions about how young people could influence policy decisions in their home countries. One exchange had been particularly notable when a teenage delegate from Australia had challenged George about whether royal privilege made it easy for him to advocate for environmental causes without understanding the economic trade-offs faced by ordinary families. Instead of becoming defensive, George had acknowledged the validity of the question and had shared observations about how environmental challenges affected different communities in different ways. He had spoken about visits to farming communities dealing with changing weather patterns and urban areas struggling with air quality issues, demonstrating that his environmental awareness was grounded in real experience rather than abstract principles. "I think you're right that I have advantages that make it easier for me to speak about these issues," George had responded honestly. "But I've also seen how climate change affects people in all kinds of different circumstances, and I think that's why we need to find solutions that work for everyone, not just solutions that sound good in speeches." This response had earned respect from the other young delegates and had led to more substantive discussions about practical approaches to environmental challenges. By the end of the summit, George had established genuine friendships with several of his international counterparts and had committed to ongoing collaboration on youth environmental initiatives. The experience had demonstrated that George was developing the ability to use his royal status as a platform for meaningful engagement rather than allowing it to create barriers between himself and his peers. This skill would be crucial as he navigated adolescence and young adulthood while maintaining both his normal development and his preparation for future leadership. As spring had progressed into summer, George's confidence and effectiveness in royal duties had continued to grow. A particularly successful engagement had been his participation in a ceremony marking the completion of a major affordable housing project that had been supported by the Prince's Trust and other royal charities. During the ceremony, George had interacted with families who were moving into the new homes, community leaders who had advocated for the project, and construction workers who had built the development. His conversations with each group had demonstrated his growing ability to adapt his communication style to different audiences while maintaining authenticity and genuine interest. The interaction that had most impressed William had been George's conversation with 8-year-old Lily Chen, whose family was among the first residents of the new development. Rather than asking generic questions about her new home, George had inquired about her school, her friends, and her hopes for the future. When Lily had mentioned that she wanted to become a doctor someday, George had asked thoughtful questions about what had inspired this ambition and whether she had met any doctors or healthcare workers. The conversation had evolved into a discussion about the importance of education and community support in helping young people achieve their goals. By the end of their conversation, George had promised to stay in touch with Lily and her family to hear about her progress in school. This commitment had not been made lightly. William knew that his son took such promises seriously and would follow through with ongoing correspondence and possible future meetings. This personal approach to royal engagement was becoming characteristic of George's developing style. Rather than viewing his duties as formal obligations to be completed, he was treating them as opportunities to build genuine relationships and to understand how royal support could make meaningful differences in people's lives. The summer had also brought George's first significant international solo engagement when he had represented the royal family at a youth leadership conference in Canada. The trip had been planned as a relatively low-key educational opportunity, but it had evolved into a significant diplomatic success that had surprised even experienced palace officials. George's week in Canada had included visits to several provinces, meetings with Indigenous leaders, and participation in environmental conservation projects. Throughout the visit, he had demonstrated remarkable cultural sensitivity and genuine curiosity about Canadian perspectives and experiences. The most significant moment of the trip had come during a meeting with Indigenous youth leaders where George had listened to presentations about traditional environmental knowledge and contemporary conservation efforts. Rather than offering generic praise or platitudes, he had asked detailed questions about how traditional practices could inform modern environmental policy. One young Indigenous leader, 16-year-old Sarah Blackhorse, had later commented to Canadian media about the authenticity of George's engagement. "He didn't talk to us like we were just part of his schedule," she had said. "He really wanted to understand what we were telling him about our relationship with the land and our concerns about environmental protection." This comment had been typical of the feedback George had received throughout the Canadian visit. People had consistently noted his genuine curiosity,
his respectful attention to different perspectives, and his ability to ask questions that demonstrated real interest in understanding rather than simply gathering information to repeat later. The success of the Canadian trip had generated discussion within the palace about expanding George's international role, but William and Catherine had remained cautious about balancing their son's royal duties with his continuing education and normal development. As autumn had approached, George had begun participating in more complex constitutional education, including sessions with former prime ministers and senior civil servants about how government and monarchy had evolved to meet changing social and political needs. These discussions had revealed George's growing sophistication in understanding how democratic institutions functioned and how constitutional monarchy provided stability and continuity within a system of elected government. His questions had demonstrated that he was developing his own philosophical framework for understanding royal duty rather than simply accepting inherited traditions. During one particularly significant session with former Prime Minister Sir John Major, George had asked about how the monarchy could remain relevant to young people who might question the relevance of inherited authority in a democratic society. Sir John had been impressed with the question and had spent considerable time discussing how the monarchy's role had evolved to emphasize service, stability, and moral leadership rather than political power. The conversation had continued with George asking about how future monarchs could continue adapting to changing social expectations while maintaining institutional continuity. By the end of the session, Sir John had privately told William that George had demonstrated exceptional understanding of the challenges facing modern monarchy and had shown the kind of thoughtful approach that suggested he would be well prepared for future leadership responsibilities. As winter had arrived, William found himself reflecting on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in George over the past year. His son had evolved from an enthusiastic but naive child into a young person who combined natural empathy with growing wisdom, institutional understanding with personal authenticity, and inherited privilege with genuine commitment to service. The subtle joy that William felt watching these developments had deepened into profound pride and confidence about the future of the monarchy. George was not simply preparing to inherit an ancient institution, he was developing the capabilities and character necessary to lead that institution through whatever challenges the 21st century might bring. Standing once again in Westminster Abbey as the winter sun set through those ancient windows, William felt a deep sense of continuity and hope. The conversation between past and future that he had described to George was continuing through his son's growing understanding and commitment. The crown that would one day rest on George's head would carry forward centuries of tradition, but it would be worn by someone who understood how to honor the past while serving the needs of the present and future. The transformation was complete, yet it was also just beginning. George had established the foundation for lifelong leadership, but the real work of kingship still lay ahead. For now, though, William felt confident that when that time came, his son would be ready, not because he had been forced into royal duty, but because he had discovered it as his natural calling and embraced it as his chosen purpose.